You didn't grow up feeling loved for who you were. You grew up feeling loved for how well you behaved, for how easy you were, for how little trouble you caused, for how closely you matched what was expected of you. Love didn't feel steady. It felt earned. And you learned that very early. You noticed it in the subtle shifts, the warmth that appeared when you did something right, the distance that followed when you didn't, the way affection arrived with conditions attached, spoken or unspoken, praise when you succeeded, withdrawal when you failed, attention when you performed, silence when you didn't. So you adapted. You became attentive. You became careful. You became good at reading what was wanted and giving it. Not because you were manipulative, but because connection depended on it. Somewhere deep inside, a belief quietly formed. If I am good enough, I will be loved. If I try harder, I won't be abandoned. If I meet expectations, I will be safe. And for a while, that belief worked. That's the paradox. The same strategy that helped you stay connected as a child slowly taught you that your natural self was not enough. That love required effort. That rest was risky. That being authentic might cost you closeness. You didn't learn this through cruelty alone. Sometimes it was subtle. Sometimes it was wrapped in care. Sometimes it looked like high standards or motivation or wanting the best for you. But the message landed all the same. Love was not something you could relax into. It was something you had to maintain. So you learned to perform. You adjusted your emotions. You softened your reactions. You hid the parts of yourself that didn't seem welcome. You learned to anticipate disappointment before it arrived. You didn't ask, "Who am I?" You asked, "Who do I need to be right now?" And now, as an adult, you may feel the residue of that lesson everywhere. You feel uneasy when you're not productive. You feel anxious when you're not improving. You feel guilty when you rest without earning it. You struggle to receive love without questioning it. You doubt affection when it's freely given. You fear that if you stop trying, something will be taken away. This is the quiet cost of conditional love. Because what once kept you connected taught you that connection was fragile. That belonging was transactional. That worth had to be proven again and again. You survived by becoming what was needed. But survival built on conditions leaves a deep imprint. Because when love is conditional, the self becomes negotiable. And until this pattern is named, until it's seen clearly, it continues to operate beneath your choices, your relationships, and your sense of value. Not loudly, not obviously, but constantly. Just the way you learn to live. What you adapted to was not discipline. It was conditional attachment. Conditional love is not always loud or abusive. Often it is quiet, structured, and socially acceptable. It shows up as approval that fluctuates, as affection that appears when expectations are met and retreats when they aren't, as care that feels real but inconsistent. From a psychological standpoint, this creates a specific developmental imprint. The child learns that connection is contingent on performance. One of the core concepts here is conditional positive regard, first described by Carl Rogers. When love, warmth, or approval are offered only when a child behaves, succeeds, or aligns with expectations, the child begins to associate worth with compliance. Authentic feelings become secondary to acceptability. You don't stop having needs. You stop expressing them. Closely related is anxious attachment. In environments where love is unpredictable, the nervous system stays alert, constantly monitoring whether connection is secure or about to be withdrawn. The child learns to work for closeness instead of resting in it. Anxious attachment is not about wanting too much. It's about never knowing when enough is enough. Another critical mechanism is introjection, the process by which external conditions and judgments become internal rules. Over time, the voice that once came from caregivers moves inside. You begin to police yourself, to push yourself, to withhold kindness from yourself until you deserve it. Neurologically, This pattern reshapes the stress and reward systems. The brain learns to associate safety with achievement and danger with failure. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter tied to reward, becomes linked not to curiosity or pleasure, but to approval. Meanwhile, the nervous system struggles to downregulate during rest because rest was never rewarded. In simple terms, your body learned that being is not enough. Doing is required. This creates a persistent internal tension. Even when nothing is demanded of you, your system stays oriented toward improvement, correction, and effort. Stillness feels uncomfortable. Ease feels suspicious. Another important concept is false self-formation, described by psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott. When a child senses that their true feelings or impulses threaten connection, they develop a false self, a version of themselves designed to meet expectations and maintain approval. The false self is not fake. It is adaptive, but it comes at a cost. Because when love is conditional, the authentic self retreats into hiding. Expression becomes filtered. Desire becomes cautious. Emotions are adjusted before they ever reach the surface. Over time, this creates a split. There is the self who performs, achieves, and pleases, and the self who waits quietly in the background, unsure if they are allowed to exist without earning their place. This is why people with this history often feel strangely disconnected from themselves. Not empty, managed, like they are constantly living slightly outside their own center. The child who learned love was conditional didn't grow up believing they were unlovable. They grew up believing love was fragile. And when love feels fragile, the nervous system organizes around protection. Perfectionism, over-responsibility, self-criticism disguised as motivation. These are not personality traits. They are strategies born from an early lesson. Connection must be maintained. Until this is understood at a psychological and neurological level, it gets misinterpreted as ambition, discipline, or high standards. But underneath all of it is a child who learned that love arrived with strings attached and never learned how to put them down. The real cost of conditional love is not anxiety. It is self-erasure. When love is something you have to earn, you don't simply work harder. You slowly stop asking yourself what you actually feel. You learn to pause before emotion arises, to intercept desire before it forms, to check whether your inner world is acceptable before letting it exist. And over time, this creates a quiet grief that is difficult to name. Not the grief of something lost, but the grief of something withheld. A self that was never allowed to fully arrive. You may feel it in moments of stillness, when nothing is required of you, and yet you feel restless, uneasy, almost guilty. You may feel it when someone offers you care freely and something inside you tightens, suspicious of generosity that isn't attached to effort. Because unconditional love was never modeled as safe. The philosopher Erich Fromm wrote that modern humans confuse love with approval. And this archetype lives precisely at that intersection. Approval feels familiar. Love feels uncertain. So you chase what you recognize, even when it costs you peace. The deepest wound here is not the absence of love. It is the distortion of it. Love became transactional. Care became contingent. Belonging became conditional. And to belong, you learn to adapt. You learn to present the parts of yourself that were rewarded and quietly suppress the parts that were inconvenient. Anger that disrupted harmony. Sadness that asked for comfort. Joy that took up too much space. Need that could not be neatly explained. Each suppression felt small, reasonable, necessary. But together, they added up to a life lived slightly at a distance from yourself. This is the invisible grief. Grief for the times you didn't speak because you weren't sure it would be received. Grief for the rest you didn't allow because it wasn't earned. Grief for the affection you distrusted because it arrived too easily. You may function well, even exceptionally, But beneath the competence is a persistent exhaustion, not from doing too much, but from managing yourself constantly. Managing tone, managing expectations, managing how much of you is allowed to show. The fear beneath it all is not failure. It is abandonment through authenticity. The fear that if you stop trying, stop improving, stop performing, something essential will be withdrawn. That connection will fade. That warmth will cool. That you'll be quietly replaced. So even joy becomes complicated. You ask yourself whether you deserve it. You wonder if it will last. You brace for the moment it might be taken away. Simple moments, rest, pleasure, connection, become mentally taxing. They carry an unspoken question. Have I done enough to be allowed this? This is where the philosophical weight deepens. Because a life built on conditional belonging teaches you to relate to yourself as a project rather than a presence. You're always becoming, improving, correcting, but rarely arriving. Carl Jung spoke of the danger of identifying too strongly with the persona, the socially acceptable self shaped by expectations. When the persona becomes the primary identity, the true self retreats into the unconscious, carrying unmet needs and unlived impulses. And what is pushed into the unconscious does not disappear. It emerges as anxiety, as emptiness, as chronic self-doubt, as the quiet sense that no matter how much you do, it is never quite enough. The tragedy is not that you learned to try. The tragedy is that you learned trying was the price of love. And until that grief is allowed, until the pain of that bargain is acknowledged, the pattern continues, convincing you that the problem is effort or discipline or mindset, when in reality, the wound is relational. You were never too much. You were never not enough. You were simply taught that love had conditions, and you organized your entire inner world around meeting them. What you learned about love did not stay in childhood. It quietly reorganized your adult life. As an adult, this pattern rarely shows up as an obvious wound. It shows up as functionality, as competence, as someone who appears driven, reliable, and emotionally controlled. But underneath that surface is the same internal logic you learned early on. Connection must be earned. You might notice it first in your relationships. You hesitate to express needs until you feel you've done enough to justify them. You overgive before you ask. You wait for the right moment that never quite arrives. And when you do speak, it often comes out carefully packaged, softened, qualified, apologized for. You might feel deeply uncomfortable receiving care without offering something in return. Compliments make you uneasy. Support feels suspicious. Love without effort feels unbalanced, almost wrong. So you compensate. You become the dependable one, the understanding one, the low-maintenance one. You tell yourself you don't need much. But that story is often a strategy, not a truth. In romantic relationships, you may find yourself drawn to partners who are emotionally inconsistent. Not because you want instability, but because it mirrors what you learned. When affection fluctuates, your system knows what to do. Try harder. Improve. Adjust. Earn closeness back. Consistency, on the other hand, can feel unfamiliar, even boring, or strangely anxiety-provoking. Because when love is steady, there's nothing to work for, and that absence of effort leaves you without a map. At work, this pattern often looks like over-responsibility. You take on more than is asked. You tie your sense of worth to productivity. Rest feels indulgent unless it's justified by exhaustion. You may fear being seen as replaceable if you slow down, so you keep proving your value. You wait to be recognized instead of advocating for yourself, or you overperform quietly, hoping someone will notice without you having to ask. Internally, the pressure never fully lifts. Your mind is often busy evaluating. Am I doing enough? Am I improving? Am I falling behind? You struggle to feel settled, even when things are objectively fine. Ease feels temporary. Safety feels conditional. And perhaps most painfully, you may struggle to know who you are without effort. When you're not achieving, helping, fixing, or pleasing, a quiet emptiness can surface. Not because you lack depth, but because your identity was built around meeting conditions, not exploring desire. These are not flaws. They're coping strategies. Strategies that once made sense in an environment where love had to be secured. The beginning of unlearning is not changing your behavior overnight. It is changing how you interpret it. Instead of asking, "Why am I like this?" you begin to ask, "What did this protect me from?" You start to notice when you overextend, when you minimize your needs, when you feel guilty for resting, when you try to earn affection instead of receiving it. And crucially, you stop gaslighting yourself. You stop telling yourself that you're too sensitive, too needy, or never satisfied. You recognize that your nervous system learned a very specific rule about love, and it has been following that rule faithfully ever since. This is where witnessing becomes transformative. You don't rush to fix the pattern. You don't shame yourself for it. You observe it with curiosity. Of course I try to earn love. Of course rest feels unsafe. Of course consistency feels unfamiliar. That recognition creates space. And in that space, something important begins to happen. The pattern loosens. Not because you force it to, but because it's no longer operating invisibly. You begin to experiment, not with performance, but with presence. You let yourself receive without immediately reciprocating. You rest without justifying it. You speak a need without earning it first. These moments are uncomfortable. They may even feel wrong, but they're also corrective. Because each time you choose to stop performing for love, you teach your nervous system something new. Connection can exist without conditions. And that realization is where real change starts. Healing from conditional love does not begin with becoming better. That instinct to improve, to fix, to optimize yourself is often just a pattern trying to survive in a new form. Because when love had conditions, healing can start to feel like another requirement, another task to complete, another way to finally earn rest. But real healing moves in the opposite direction. It begins when you stop asking, "How do I become worthy of love?" and start asking, "What would it feel like to let love exist without conditions?" This is where inner child reparenting becomes more than a concept. It is the slow, repeated practice of offering yourself what was missing: emotional consistency, gentleness without prerequisites, presence without evaluation. It's noticing the moment you feel the urge to prove yourself, and instead of obeying it, you pause. You breathe. You tell the younger part of you, you don't have to earn your place here. This is not a one-time realization. It's a relationship you rebuild over time. There's also a role here for shadow work, not in the dramatic sense, but in the honest one. The shadow, in this case, is not something dark or dangerous. It is the part of you that learned to hide desire, need, and softness because they were not reliably met. Healing means allowing those parts back into consciousness, letting yourself want without immediately justifying it, letting yourself feel without immediately explaining it away, letting yourself rest without narrating your productivity first. And this will feel uncomfortable, because rest without earning can trigger guilt. Receiving without giving can trigger anxiety. Being loved without conditions can feel unreal. These reactions are not signs that something is wrong. They are signs that something new is happening. Your nervous system is learning a different rhythm. One of the most important shifts here is choosing softness deliberately, not passivity, not avoidance. Softness as an act of courage. Softness means staying present when you want to perform. It means tolerating the discomfort of being valued without effort. It means allowing yourself to exist without constantly proving usefulness. The philosopher Simone Weil wrote that attention, taken to its highest degree, is love. And perhaps that is the truest repair here. Not forcing yourself to change, but learning to stay with yourself without conditions. To attend to your own experience without judgment. To listen without correction. To be with yourself without requirements. This does not mean you stop growing. It means growth is no longer the price of belonging. Over time, something subtle begins to shift. You notice that rest no longer feels like failure. That love no longer feels like something that can be taken away at any moment. That you can disappoint someone and still remain connected to them and to yourself. Your identity loosens its grip on performance. You begin to feel moments of internal quiet, not the tense quiet of self-monitoring, but the settled quiet of safety. A quiet that doesn't ask anything of you. This is what wholeness looks like. Not perfection, not constant confidence, but the absence of the internal bargain. You no longer have to ask, "Am I enough yet?" Because the question itself loses relevance. You were never meant to earn love. You were meant to experience it. And the most radical healing, in the end, is allowing that truth to land, not as an idea, but as a lived reality. If this resonated with you, consider sharing it, not as a solution, but as recognition. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can offer each other is language for a pain we never knew how to name. You're not broken. You were conditioned. And now, gently, patiently, you are allowed to stop performing for a sense of belonging that was always meant to be yours. The goal was never to be fixed. The goal was to come home to yourself without conditions.